Good afternoon. This video is recorded specifically for my Year 12 history class. Yesterday we looked at the Kulturkampf. We didn't quite get to the end of the lesson, so I'm going to focus on the last 10 slides, the 41 slides altogether, and I think we covered 31 of them in the lesson yesterday, so we just need to cover the final 10. So the emphasis of what we're going to cover here is really on what the Kulturkampf was and what the impact, the consequences of the Kulturkampf were. What we focused on in the lesson yesterday was primarily the sort of background to it, understanding the reasons why the Kulturkampf happened, the tensions that existed between the German Catholics and Bismarck, and of course Bismarck worked closely with the support of the National Liberals in the first few years of his period as Chancellor of the United Germany that came into existence in 1871. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll quickly scroll through the first 31 slides and just reach the point that we got to in the lesson, and then we'll start to work our way through that, and you can finish off the mind mapping. Okay, so that's the slide we reached. So let's just pick up the key points. So the Centre Party was becoming a magnet, basically. That was Bismarck's anxiety. It wasn't just the fact that there was a political party called the Catholic Centre Party that Bismarck sort of viewed as being potential traitors, because the voters for the Catholic Centre Party, German Catholics, they were taking their loyalty, and Bismarck's view was towards Rome, the imprisoned papacy and the Vatican, who had issued those two statements in the 1860s, or 1864 and 1870. But it was more the fact that because the Centre Party was so fiercely opposed, or appeared to be so fiercely opposed to Bismarck as the head of the German government, that other groups that opposed the German state may be attracted to vote for the Centre Party as well. And in particular, Bismarck was worried about the various national minorities that existed in Germany at this time. So we've spoken about the various national minorities, the French national minorities in Alsace-Lorraine. There were Poles living in the east, and those two groups in particular there were large numbers of Catholics amongst those groups. So non-Catholic minorities, Catholic minorities, but also non-Catholic minorities. Danes living in the north, as an example of that, and so on. Okay, I mean another minority were Jewish Germans. Okay, so again, in Bismarck's mind, anybody who was a minority might be attracted to the Centre Party, which could become their political voice. Okay, so Bismarck therefore saw German Catholics as being enemies of the empire, Reichsfeinde. Okay, and in some ways he viewed them the same way that he viewed the socialists. So that's an important comparison. Okay, because both socialists and Catholics were international groups. Okay, so we've already looked at the socialists. Okay, socialism was the ideology of the working classes, and working classes were an international movement. It was a growing international movement, the growing industrial workers of cities. Industrialization happened across many countries, and the working classes, following the socialism, the ideology of Karl Marx, argued that workers of the world should unite together against the capitalists, in other words, the rich of the world. So socialists were international. Well, likewise, Catholics, okay, was an international religion. Catholics in every country of the world, following the Pope. The Pope as the head of the Catholic Church. So Catholics and socialists, in Bismarck's mind, he viewed them in the same way as potential enemies, because Bismarck was a nationalist. He was the leader of this new united Germany, and he wanted German people to give their first loyalty to the new national government of which he was the head. So Bismarck therefore launched a campaign against the Catholics, which was called the Kulturkampf. Now, initially, Bismarck tried to persuade the Pope to withdraw his support for the Catholic Centre Party, but that was rejected. Okay, so Bismarck therefore joined with the National Liberals in a campaign against Catholic institutions and power within Germany. Now, it made tactical sense because at that time, in the early 1870s, of course, Bismarck was already working closely with the National Liberals to pass those various unifying laws that, for example, created a single currency for Germany, laws that created a common standard of weights and measures, civil code, legal code, etc., etc. So we did that in the previous lesson. At that time, it made complete sense. Bismarck and the National Liberals were working closely together. After all, the National Liberals were the largest party in the Reichstag. And remember, the Reichstag was the lower house of the parliament, and to pass any law, it needed a 51% or higher vote in the Reichstag, and the National Liberals they were the largest party in the Reichstag. They didn't have 51% of the seats, but if you combine their seats, add to that the German Conservative Party seats, Bismarck had that majority, 51% or more of the seats in the Reichstag. So Bismarck was working closely with the National Liberals, so therefore he could use that support to pass laws, against the Reichstag. Now, initially, a series of laws were passed in Prussia, allowing state authorities to inspect Catholic schools. So that was the focus within Prussia. Remember, Bismarck was not just the Chancellor of Germany, he was also the Prime Minister of Prussia, and there was a Prussian parliament, the Landtag. So the initial focus of Bismarck's campaign was only within Prussia. Now, Prussia, when we say only within Prussia, was by far the largest state in Germany, and actually 60% of Germany was Protestant. So these laws initially allowed the Prussian state government to inspect Catholic schools and to ban Jesuits from Germany. Remember, one of the powers of the state governments was education, which is why he started his attack within Prussia. In 1873, the May laws were passed. In Prussia, which gave the state wide-ranging power again over schools, over education, and in particular the appointment of priests. So you can sort of see the Kulturkampf was very much sort of like in the early 1870s. So pulling back a little bit there. There's a cartoon between Berlin and Rome, Bismarck on the left and the Pope on the right, from a German magazine, Kladderadatsch, 1875. Commenting on the sort of like political manoeuvrings that are happening between Bismarck and the papacy. Now, the Catholic Church resisted, and when it resisted, Bismarck then turned to more draconian measures, okay? In other words, more extreme. He said, right, okay, well, if you're going to push back, I'm going to push harder, which is kind of like the comment of that satirical cartoon from 1875, where the papal bull, the papacy is represented as a bull being stubborn. Catholics are not going to give in, so Bismarck is now grabbing the bull by the horns. So, if priests resisted, church property was then seized. Okay, so clergy not appointed by the Prussian state were physically expelled from Prussia. Okay, they were just banished. And then the breadbasket law withdrew financial support from any priest who did not declare his support for the German state. So the breadbasket law. So it was an ongoing campaign. It started in 1873, and by 1879, in other words 6 years later, nearly 2,000 priests had been jailed or banished from Prussia. About 16 million Reichsmark value of church property had been seized, and even in some instances, Bismarck had called upon the Prussian army to put down Catholic protests. Okay, so the resistance was that fierce by German Catholics. Okay, so we're nearly there. We've built up our mind map. What we've looked at so far is we've looked at the definitions, we've looked at the papal statements, we've looked at who the German Catholics were and the formation of their centre party, and then what we've just done there is we've looked at the reaction by Bismarck, okay? In other words, the Kulturkampf itself, okay? So we've got one more strand to look at, which is ultimately the Bismarck's defeat, his acknowledgement of failure, the fact that this policy was not working. So in a nutshell, the Kulturkampf failed to achieve its objectives. German Catholics fiercely resisted Bismarck's measures, and for various different reasons, which we'll look at beneath this surface slide. In the late 1870s, Bismarck therefore changed his position and he abandoned the Kulturkampf. A central reason was that at this very same time, Bismarck was turning against the National Liberals, whom he had worked with in the early 1870s, okay, which we of course looked at in the previous lesson. Okay, so the topic of the Kulturkampf is not a separate topic from the previous lesson. It kind of like is interwoven throughout the previous lesson's topic. So remember, in the previous lesson, we saw how Bismarck initially worked with the National Liberals when he wanted to create an open market within Germany. But then after the recession of the mid-1870s, Bismarck needed to introduce protectionism, okay, putting tariffs around Germany, and that meant that a significant proportion of the National Liberals went into opposition against Bismarck because they wanted to cling to free trade, and so Bismarck therefore started to treat the National Liberals as enemies. And we said that in that lesson. We said at that point, up until that point, Bismarck had known that he would have the support of the National Liberals in the Reichstag to pass any laws. But from the late 1870s onwards, once he introduced protectionism, he could no longer rely on the support of the National Liberals, so he needed to find support elsewhere. And as we said, where was that support? Then the second largest party in the Reichstag that Bismarck turned to was the Centre Party. Okay, so that's how it dovetails into this particular topic. So the point here, a central reason was at this very same time, so I'll just get my pen to work. There we go. It was at this very same time Bismarck was turning against the National Liberals, whom he had worked with in the early 1870s. As a result, Bismarck needed political support in the Reichstag, now that he could no longer depend on the same amount of support from the National Liberals. the obvious political party that could now give him the support that he needed was the Catholic Centre Party. So calling off the Kulturkampf, the campaign against the Catholics in the late 1870s, made sense. It gave Bismarck the opportunity he was looking for to win political support in the Reichstag from the Centre Party. In his new campaign, which was against the National Liberals, who were not really playing ball when it came to protectionism. Okay, so that's the in a nutshell. So just going into the details behind that, let's just go through the points just to make sure we're clear. So Bismarck's persecution of the Catholics, picking on them, attacking them, etc., actually reinforced Catholic separatist feelings. That's a nice word to use. Okay, Catholic separatist feelings. Separatism being the sort of notion of we are different, that we will rally together. We're different from other Germans and we will rally together. So actually, therefore, so it's a nice word to use, separatist. Okay, so as a result, the Kulturkampf basically completely backfired because it strengthened support for the Centre Party. German Catholics became ostracised. Okay, another nice word for you to use. They became defensive, they became distanced, completely the opposite from what Bismarck had wanted. What Bismarck wanted was to make German Catholics loyal to the new German state. But the reverse happened. German Catholics rallied together in defence and they became more aware of their special identity and that they were different and they became proud of that. Okay, and so in every sense, the Kulturkampf was a failure. So examples of that, Catholics were disadvantaged in finding employment, especially in public office, business and finance. Catholics were disadvantaged in education. If you were a Protestant, you were 50% more likely to obtain university places. So all of these, as a result of the Kulturkampf, made Catholics rally together. We need to look after each other because we are now a disadvantaged group. So the Centre Party, therefore, became one of the few parties that was supported across Germany's divided classes. And one of the things, if you look at those Reichstag election graphs, whereas other political parties on that graph, their vote tended to go up and down over time. If you follow and look at the over time, the Centre Party were very solid. Okay, they maintained their election support. Okay, it didn't go up massively, but it didn't go down massively either. In other words, German Catholics were remarkably loyal to the Centre Party. Okay, and the reason that they were remarkably loyal was because of the Kulturkampf. Okay, if there hadn't been the Kulturkampf, then Bismarck may have been able to persuade German Catholics to vote for the German Conservative Party, for example, but they were not going to do that. The German Catholics, their support stuck with the Centre Party. So what drew them together was not just their faith, but also the fact that they felt persecuted. Okay, so evidence of that. The Centre Party vote, if you actually look at it, actually increased from 19% to 28% in 1874. So it went up by about 50%. Okay, so from 19% to 28% during the years 1817 to 1874, and of course that was the period. In 1873, the May Laws were introduced. Okay, and by 1878, they were the equal largest party in the Reichstag, along with the National Liberals. By 1878, okay, so massively backfired. Okay, another cartoon from 1884. Okay, not sure what the German says, but I read that sort of cartoon, culture, and in a sense, there's Bismarck stoking the engine and there's the leader of the Catholic Centre Party who's basically in control of the train now. So it's a comment, by my reading of it, is that Bismarck basically is now dependent on the Catholic Centre Party. The Catholic Centre Party, in a sense, are controlling Bismarck, and that's not what he wanted. Okay, so let's look at the election graphs just so we're clear. So there's 1871. So as you can see, the Centre Party had about 18%, and by 1878 it's gone up to 28%, which is the same as the National Liberals. Okay, so ultimately the Kulturkampf was called off. Okay, so Bismarck abandoned the Kulturkampf, and so you can articulate the reasons for this. If you have to write about this in the exam, think of 4 main reasons. Firstly, it was not working. Okay, the reasons were just said. Secondly, for tactical reasons. Okay, by the late 1870s, Bismarck's alliance with the National Liberals was weakening because the National Liberals were moving toward, were resisting Bismarck, who wanted to move towards protectionism. So we've covered that. Thirdly, as a result of this, Bismarck therefore needed the support of the Centre Party because they've got 28% of the seats. Okay, he needed their vote in his campaign against the National Liberals in order to push protectionist policies through the Reichstag. Because remember, Bismarck cannot pass laws. He can initiate policy, but policy cannot become a law until the sufficient support has been won in the Reichstag. Bismarck has literally got to walk into the Reichstag and say, I want to be legalised protectionist policies, and the Reichstag votes on it, and Bismarck has got to get 51% or more of the Reichstag to vote for it. And so he needed the Centre Party to vote with him on that. Okay. Then in 1878, Pope Pius IX died. I was right, it was Pius IX. I was asked in the lesson yesterday what the name of the Pope was. And he was replaced by Pope Leo XIII, who was less hard-line in his approach towards Bismarck. Okay, so but yeah, part of that was sort of like the personalities involved. There's Pope Pius IX. He was the Pope in the 1870s while the Kulturkampf was being waged. So when you look at those cartoons, which is Bismarck face to face with the stubborn bull was Pope Pius the Ninth, 1x. And in a sense, politically, it was difficult for either side to back down, okay, because you would lose your political reputation would suffer if you were seen to be the first one to step down when you kind of like at loggerheads like this, and neither side wanted to be seen to be the one to back down. So the good thing is from Bismarck's point of view, when Pope Pius IX died and a new pope came in, Pope Leo XIII was able to back down, okay, to step down and to send out signals that he wanted the struggle to end, because he was a new pope. And that therefore gave Bismarck the opportunity, in a sense, to pull away from the Kulturkampf without losing face, okay, without being seen to be the person who would step down first. So again, that's why you need to make sure you mention Leo XIII if you're talking about the opportunity that Bismarck had to back down. So over time, German Catholics were therefore now able to become more assimilated within the German nation. Assimilated, that's another good word. Assimilated means to become part of, to integrate, to become part of this new united German nation. Because what had happened in the 1870s as a result of the Kulturkampf, they rallied together and they became very defined, and we're different. But over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and it did take a long time, that hardening of the battle lines began to soften, and German Catholics felt more welcomed and were able to become part of the new united German nation. That's the point that's being made there. Kaiser Wilhelm I, he was the Kaiser from 1871 to 1888. He was the Kaiser who was a big backer of Bismarck. Bismarck got on well with him. Bismarck was, of course, head of government. The Kaiser was the emperor, the head of state. Kaiser Wilhelm I was the lead junker, okay? He was the head of state and the ultimate upper class, okay? And the Prussian junkers were, of course, very dominant in ruling and controlling the key power positions in this new united Germany. So Kaiser Wilhelm I also was very opposed to what Bismarck was doing. Okay, Bismarck had attacked the Catholics, but the Kaiser, although he sort of like could at any point step in and get rid of Bismarck, never had. But the Kaiser had always been uncomfortable with this struggle of culture between Bismarck and the National Liberals on one side and the Catholics on the other. Why was that? Okay, because the Junkers were very traditional, okay, and they were very conservative. They didn't really like change, and the Kaiser saw Catholics as being similar people, okay, very traditional, very conservative, okay, had been around for hundreds of years, Catholics, okay, so the Kaiser didn't quite see them the same way that Bismarck saw them. Bismarck very much saw them as the Reich, the enemies of the Reich, because their loyalty lay to a boss in Rome. Bismarck saw the Catholics as being international and therefore being potentially traitors. The Kaiser was much more trusting of Catholics. Okay, so that's the sort of point that's being made there. Also, they were against modern ideas, including secularization and liberalism. Catholics were very anti-modern, okay? And these sorts of ideas like liberalism and secularization, of course, are new ideas that have come out of the Industrial Revolution. You know, that the priest should stay out of government, that government has got nothing to do with religion, and that religion and government should be separated, okay? Which they identified with industrialization. Okay, so liberalism, the middle classes, were secularism, were new ways of thinking that had come out of the Industrial Revolution. And remember, the Junkers were ultimately farming classes that had been powerful for hundreds of years, ever since Prussia as a sort of modern state was born in the 17th century. The Junkers had always been a sort of strong rural agricultural group of people, and the Kaiser was sort of like very apprehensive about industrialization and the fact it was undermining traditional conservative values, and so therefore the Kaiser again tended to identify with the Catholics. He could sympathize with the Catholics, believed that these things undermine the traditional power of the old rural elites. So, but what we're saying is Catholicism and the values of the Junkers were actually overlapped. Okay, so old rural elites, the Junkers, very traditional values, whereas the new industrial elites, the represented by the National Liberals and the middle classes, were very secular values. So therefore the Kaiser and the old elites actually felt it was possible to work with the Catholics, which is why the Kaiser was quite relieved when Bismarck abandoned the attack on the Catholics. Okay, so there's a screenshot of a document. I won't read it through with you, but it's just really a reminder that there's a third of the exam paper in which you've actually got to read a quite significantly long document, and you've really got to be able to get into what a document means. So here is a document. Edward Husgen was a leading Catholic writer and campaigner in 1871. He was dismissed from serving in judicial in the judicial system in Prussia, the legal system, because he was linked with the Centre Party newspaper. Then, sort of 40 odd years later, in 1907, he described some of the motivations and the impact of the Kulturkampf. Okay, so I won't read that document to you, but there is somebody from the time who was a Catholic writer and campaigner writing about what it was like to live through the Kulturkampf. Okay, so in the exam you could then be asked a question about that if that was in the exam paper. So have a read of that, and a lot of the lessons I teach you, there's a document at the back of the notes. Always make sure you read that and understand what the document is saying. And in a lesson fairly soon, we're going to be looking at how to answer these document questions. Okay, so there's our big picture. All the notes, all the in a nutshell points together in one place. And there's our flip learning for next lesson, where we'll look at the appeal to nationalism to achieve unity. Read the textbook, pages 79 to 82. As you read, focus on the following questions: the lack of national symbols, the various ways that Bismarck promoted nationalism through education, culture, and the targeting of internal and external enemies, and what was the outcome of Bismarck's policies. Okay, so that's for next lesson. That's it. We finished off this lesson. Over to you now to do the additional reading, and I will see you next week.